The Bitterroot Woods swallow secrets whole. Bears, blizzards, and time erase a body fast, but iron takes longer to rot. Caleb smelled the rust before he saw it, a heavy forged chain bolted into the heart of a century-old pine. It wasn't an animal trap. The chain stretched down a steep ravine, ending in a crude, half-buried root cellar. What he found at the end of that chain shattered everything he knew about the monsters living in the valley below. The wind off the high ridge carried the scent of coming snow. It was a sharp, metallic odor that stung the inside of Caleb Boone's nose. He had been tracking a bull elk since dawn, his snowshoes crunching softly, rhythmically against the frozen crust of the earth. Here, 20 miles from the nearest semblance of a town, the silence was usually absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet that drove lesser men mad. Caleb liked it. It asked nothing of him. He paused, resting the stock of his Winchester against his thigh. He wiped a gloved hand across his frost-chapped beard. He had lost the elk's trail near a dense thicket of lodgepole pines, the tracks obscured by a sudden drift. But it wasn't the lost tracks that stopped him. It was a sound. A dull, unnatural clink. It was faint, swallowed almost instantly by the wind, but Caleb's ears were tuned to the frequency of the wild. That wasn't rock striking rock. It wasn't antler against bark. It was iron. He racked a shell into the chamber of his rifle. Out here, iron meant another man. And another man out here usually meant trouble. Caleb abandoned the elk trail and moved laterally along the ridge, stepping carefully to avoid deadfall. He descended into a narrow, sun-starved ravine where the shadows pooled like black water. The air here was 10 degrees colder. Dead ferns crunched under his boots. Then he saw it. Driven deep into the trunk of a massive ancient pine was a steel spike. Welded to the head of the spike was a heavy iron ring, and attached to that ring was a chain. It was thick forged of crude, heavy links, heavily pitted with orange rust. The chain snaked away from the tree, disappearing into the dense underbrush down the slope. Caleb frowned. Trappers used chains, sure, but not like this. This was heavy-duty industrial iron. It belonged in a rail yard, not the Bitterroots. He followed the chain. It scraped against the frozen dirt, the links polished smooth on the bottom, where they had dragged back and forth over a long period. 10 yards, 20 yards. The chain ended at the base of a sheer rock face, disappearing into a narrow cleft, obscured by a tangle of dead blackberry brambles. He used the barrel of his rifle to push the thorny branches aside. Behind the brush was a hole. It looked like an old, collapsed mining adit, or a crude root cellar dug into the side of the mountain. Heavy timber shored up the entrance, though the wood was rotting. A foul stench wafted from the dark opening, unwashed bodies, excrement, and something distinctly metallic. Blood. Old blood. Caleb pulled a strike anywhere. Match from his coat struck it against a rock and held it forward. The small yellow flame pushed back the gloom. At the back of the dirt cave, something moved. It scrambled away from the light, a frantic shuffling sound, accompanied by the heavy clank-drag of the chain. Caleb drew his Colt revolver with his free hand, holding the match higher. The flame caught the reflection of 2 wide, terrified eyes. Caleb stopped breathing. He lowered the gun. It was a woman, or at least the remnants of one. She was huddled against the damp earth wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She wore a dress made of patched flour sacks and burlap stained stiff with mud and filth. Her hair was a matted grey-brown bird's nest that fell over her face. She was emaciated. Her arms were nothing but bone and tight, translucent skin. But it was the chain that made Caleb's stomach turn. It was padlocked to a heavy iron collar around her neck. The match burned his fingers. He dropped it. Total darkness swallowed them again. Jesus Almighty! Caleb whispered into the dark. He didn't move. He knew from dealing with cornered, wounded animals that sudden movements meant violence. He holstered his gun. He reached into his coat and struck another match, lighting a small kerosene lantern he kept clipped to his belt. He held the lantern up, casting a steady, warm glow over the grim cave. She flinched, turning her face into the dirt, throwing her bony arms over her head to ward off a blow. She was shaking violently, her breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps. "I'm not going to hurt you," Caleb said. His voice was gravelly from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 months. It sounded harsh even to him. She didn't answer. She just pressed herself harder against the wall, as if trying to merge with the cold stone. Caleb took a slow step forward. The chain rattled. She let out a sound, not a scream, but a low, broken whimper that sounded more animal than human. It was the sound of a creature that had forgotten how to hope. "Easy," he murmured. He crouched down, keeping his distance. "My name is Caleb. I'm just a trapper. I'm going to get you out of here." He looked at the setup. The chain allowed her maybe 15 feet of movement, just enough to crawl out to the snow to get water, just enough to relieve herself in a shallow trench near the entrance. There was a tin bucket near her, completely dry. A few scattered mouldy potatoes lay in the dirt. Someone had kept her here, fed her just enough to keep her breathing. Anger, cold and sharp as a hunting knife, pierced Caleb's chest. He was a cynical man. He had seen men kill each other over a misplaced card, over a few ounces of gold, over a perceived slight. He knew the frontier was a bloody, ruthless place. But this required a different kind of evil. This was premeditated, sustained cruelty. He looked at the heavy padlock resting against her collarbone. It was thick, forged brass. No keyhole he could pick with a wire. "I have to leave for a minute," Caleb said, keeping his voice steady and low. "My mule is up the ridge. I have tools. I'm coming right back." She peeked through the matted curtain of her hair. Her eyes were a pale, striking blue, though they were, clouded with terror and exhaustion. She didn't nod. She didn't speak. She just watched him. Caleb backed out of the cave, the smell of fresh, cold pine hitting him like a physical blow. He looked down at the valley far below, where the smoke from the town of Oakhaven curled lazily into the grey sky. Somebody down there was a monster. And Caleb was going to find out who. The wind had picked up by the time Caleb returned to the cave carrying fat, wet flakes of snow. A blizzard was coming. The Bitterroot Mountains were unforgiving. If they didn't get off this ridge before the heavy snow hit, they would freeze to death, collar or no collar. He carried a heavy canvas roll of tools and a thick wool blanket from his pack. When he ducked back into the dark recess of the root cellar, she was in the exact same position. She hadn't moved an inch. The lantern he had left behind cast long, flickering shadows. "I'm back," he said softly. He unrolled the canvas. He pulled out a heavy, cold chisel and a short-handled sledgehammer. The tools looked brutal. When she saw the hammer, she let out a sharp cry and scrambled backward, the chain snapping taut against the iron ring on her neck. She choked, gagging, as the collar bit into her flesh. "No, no, no." Caleb dropped the hammer. He held his hands up, palms open. "I'm not hitting you. I have to break the chain. I have to cut the iron." She coughed her thin hands, desperately clawing at the thick leather underneath the iron collar. Whoever had made the collar had lined it with leather to prevent the metal from slicing her throat completely, a sickening detail that spoke to the captor's desire to keep her alive. Caleb took the wool blanket and approached her slowly. She tensed, bracing for impact. He draped the heavy wool over her trembling shoulders. "It's going to be loud," he said. "And you have to hold still. If you move, I might miss." He picked up the chisel and hammer. He knelt beside her. The smell of her was overwhelming up-close decay sickness and years of accumulated grime. He didn't blink. He gently reached out and grasped a link of the chain about a foot from her neck. Her skin was ice cold. He laid the chain across a large, flat rock protruding from the cave floor. He placed the sharp edge of the chisel against the weld of the link. "Close your eyes," he ordered gently. She didn't. She stared at the hammer, her whole body vibrating with terror. Caleb swung. Metal struck metal with a deafening crack that echoed painfully in the confined space. She flinched violently, letting out a sob, but she didn't pull away. Caleb checked the link. The chisel had bitten deep into the rusted iron. "Good," he murmured. "You're doing good." 2 more. He struck again. Crack. Sparks showered in the dim light. The link bent. He readjusted the chisel, took a breath, and brought the sledgehammer down with all the strength in his thick arm. Crack. The iron sheared. The chain fell away with a heavy dead clatter against the stone. She was free from the tree, but the collar and a foot of broken chain still hung from her neck. Taking the collar off would require a hacksaw, and time they didn't have. The temperature was dropping fast. Caleb threw the tools back into the canvas roll. He stood up and offered her his hand. "We have to go. Snow's falling heavy." She stared at his hand. She looked at the severed chain on the floor. She slowly brought her hand up to the collar, touching the jagged edge of the broken link. She looked confused, as if the concept of movement without the tug of the wall was entirely foreign to her brain. She tried to stand. Her legs, atrophied from years of confinement and weak from starvation, gave out immediately. She collapsed into the dirt. Caleb didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, scooped her up, and lifted her into his arms. She weighed nothing. Maybe 80 pounds. It was like carrying a hollow pile of kindling. She gasped instinctively, wrapping her frail arms around his thick neck. She buried her face into the rough canvas of his coat. She was shaking so hard, Caleb could feel it in his own bones. "I got you," he said. He carried her out of the cellar and into the biting wind. The snow was falling thick now, a wall of white erasing the timberline. Caleb's mule, a stubborn grey beast named Barnaby, was tied to a spruce a few yards away, coated in a thin layer of snow. Caleb hoisted the woman onto the saddle, wrapping the wool blanket tighter around her, tucking the edges under her legs. He took the lead rope. "Hold on to the horn," he instructed. Her skeletal fingers gripped the leather horn of the saddle with a desperate strength. The journey back to his cabin was a brutal test of endurance. It was 5 miles through steep, treacherous terrain. The snow deepened rapidly, pulling at Caleb's snowshoes, burning his thighs. The wind howled a constant abrasive roar that stripped the heat from his body. He looked back every few minutes. She was hunched over a lump of snow-covered wool on the back of the mule. The broken chain dangled from her neck, clinking softly against the saddle. She didn't complain. She didn't make a sound. It took them 4 hours to cover the 5 miles. By the time the dark silhouette of Caleb's log cabin appeared through the squall, twilight had fallen, painting the blizzard in shades of bruising purple. Caleb pushed the heavy oak door open and led the mule straight inside the main room. He didn't care about the mess. The cabin was large enough. He lifted the woman down from the saddle. She was unresponsive, her lips blue, her eyes half closed. He laid her on his own bed in the corner, a heavy frame piled with bear and wolf pelts. He moved efficiently. He struck a match to the kindling already laid in the cast-iron stove. Within minutes, a fire was roaring, pushing the bitter cold back into the corners of the room. He lit the oil lamps. He filled a pot with snow and set it on the stove to boil. He returned to the bed and pulled the wet wool blanket off her. She was unconscious. Caleb took a pair of heavy tin snips from his workbench. He carefully cut away the stiff, filthy burlap rags she wore as a dress, leaving her in a tattered linen chemise. Her body was a road map of suffering. Bruises, old yellowed scars, and raw sores from lying in the dirt. But her feet were the worst. Her toes were black with frostbite. He soaked a rag in the warm water and gently began to wash the mud and dried blood from her face and hands. As the grime washed away, he saw her features clearly for the first time. She was younger than he had thought. Maybe late 20s. Before the starvation and the dirt, she would have been beautiful. He wrapped her tightly in the dry furs. He couldn't do anything about the collar yet. Not until she was stable. Caleb sat in a wooden chair beside the bed, staring at the brass padlock resting against her pale throat. He leaned in closer, wiping the tarnish off the brass with his thumb. There was a stamp etched into the metal. A manufacturer's mark. GDW and Company High Security. Caleb leaned back, the blood running cold in his veins despite the heat of the fire. He knew that lock. He knew the mercantile in Oakhaven that sold them. They were expensive, imported from back east. They weren't sold to trappers or miners. They were sold to men who kept payrolls, men who owned businesses. The beast that had chained this woman wasn't some wild savage living in the woods. It was a man in a suit. The fever broke on the 4th night. For 3 days, the cabin had been a purgatory of sweat delirium and haunting screams. The woman fought battles in her mind that Caleb couldn't see, thrashing against the heavy furs, screaming for someone to stop begging for water she couldn't swallow. Caleb hardly slept. He forced spoonfuls of weak venison broth between her chapped lips. He applied a poultice of crushed pine needles and boiled fat to her frostbitten feet, praying he wouldn't have to amputate her toes with his hunting knife. He kept the fire burning so hot the cabin felt like a kiln. During her thrashing, he had managed to pick the lock. He hadn't used a key. He had spent 4 hours meticulously filing down the brass shackle of the padlock with a jeweler's file he used for gunsmithing until he could snap it with pliers. When the collar finally fell away, it left a ring of bruised, raw flesh around her neck. She had unconsciously reached up to rub her throat in her sleep, her fingers confused by the absence of the heavy iron. On the evening of the 4th day, the wind outside died down. The sudden silence in the cabin was heavy. Caleb was sitting at his table, oiling the action of his Winchester, the smell of hops solvent sharp in the air. He heard a rustle of blankets. He turned. She was sitting up. The furs were pooled around her waist. She was wearing one of his old flannel shirts, which swallowed her frail frame. Her pale blue eyes were lucid, darting around the cabin, taking in the drying pelts on the walls, the crackling stove, the heavy timber beams. Her gaze landed on Caleb. He froze, the oily rag paused over his rifle. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She just stared at him with a profound, aching exhaustion. "You cut it," she whispered. Her voice was a rasp destroyed by years of disuse and the abrasive friction of the collar. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across a stone. Caleb set the rifle down. He stood up slowly, pouring a tin cup of water from the pitcher on the table. He walked over to the bed and offered it to her. Her hands shook violently as she took it, using both hands to guide the rim to her mouth. She drank greedily water, spilling down her chin. "Not too fast," Caleb warned gently. "You'll throw it back up." She lowered the cup. She looked down at her wrists, rubbing the pale skin there. Then she reached up and touched her bare neck. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her hollow cheeks. "I'm dead," she said softly. "This is dead." "You're alive," Caleb said. He pulled up his chair and sat a few feet from the bed. "You're in my cabin, up on the north ridge of the Bitterroots. It's late November." She looked at him, trying to process the information. "November," she breathed. "What year?" Caleb's heart sank. 1882. She closed her eyes. A silent sob racked her chest. 3 years. He told me it was only months. Who told you? She opened her eyes. The terror was gone, replaced by a cold, dead emptiness that was somehow much worse to look at. My name is Clara, she said. I'm Caleb. Caleb Boone. Clara looked at the brass padlock sitting on the bedside table, a piece of the shackle still wedged inside it. You broke it. Took a while, but yeah, it's gone. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Clara, you need to tell me what happened. Who put you in that hole? She shrank back slightly, pulling the flannel shirt tighter around her collarbone. If I tell you, he'll kill you. He kills everyone who gets in his way. He told me that. He said if I ever got loose, he'd hunt down whoever helped me and burn them alive. Let him try, Caleb said. His voice carried no bravado, just a flat, absolute certainty. He gestured to the heavy rifle on the table. I shoot straighter than God. And I know these woods better than any man in the valley. Nobody is burning my cabin. Clara stared at his face. She saw the deep lines around his eyes, the grey in his beard, the steady, unblinking calm of a man who had faced down grizzlies and blizzards and survived. He's a powerful man, she whispered. Everyone loves him. They listen to him. They trust him. Men trust fools all the time, Caleb said. Doesn't make them right. Was it a husband? No. Clara swallowed hard. I worked for him. I kept his books. I found things. Missing money. Land deeds transferred to ghost names. Money the town had raised for the new rail spur. He was stealing all of it. Who? Caleb pressed his voice, dropping an octave. Clara looked away, staring into the flames, visible through the grated door of the stove. When I told him I was going to the territorial marshal, she continued, her voice trembling. He smiled. He poured me a cup of tea. He said we could fix it. He put something in the tea. When I woke up, I was in the dark, with that iron around my neck. She looked back at Caleb. It was the mayor, Clara said. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. It was Tobias Finch. Caleb sat perfectly still. Tobias Finch, the mayor of Oakhaven, the man who had built the church, who shook hands with the governor, who ran the town with a benevolent smile and a velvet glove. Finch owned the mercantile. Finch bought those brass locks. Finch had kept a human being chained in a lightless hole for 3 years to cover his own theft. A dark, violent truth settled into Caleb's bones. He wasn't just a trapper anymore. He had crossed an invisible line the moment he struck that chisel. Finch, Caleb repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It tasted like ash. He came up every few weeks, Clara whispered, pulling her knees to her chest. Brought potatoes, water, just enough. He liked to sit on a rock and watch me cry. He said I was his penance, that as long as I suffered, God wouldn't punish him for the stealing. Caleb stood up. He walked over to his workbench and picked up his heavy leather gun belt. He began feeding thick brass .45 caliber cartridges into the loops one by one. Clara watched him, her eyes widening. What are you doing? You're going to rest, Clara. Caleb said, his back to her, as he checked the action on his Colt. You're going to eat, and you're going to heal. He turned to face her, strapping the heavy iron to his hip. The firelight caught the grim cold set of his jaw. And when you're strong enough to ride a mule, Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, we're going down to Oakhaven, and I'm going to introduce Mayor Finch to the end of a chain. December crept over the Bitterroots, burying the world under 4 feet of dead white silence. Inside Caleb's cabin, time measured itself not in days, but in the slow return of Clara's humanity. It started with small things. The way she stopped flinching when a log popped in the iron stove. The day she finally looked Caleb in the eye when he handed her a plate of salted pork and beans instead of staring at the floorboards. The morning he woke to find her standing by the frost-rimed window, watching a pair of grey jays fight over a sweat scrap. She was putting on weight. The sharp, skeletal jut of her collarbone softened. The hollows of her cheeks filled out, revealing a jawline that was stubbornly square. But her hair was a ruin. 3 years of dirt grease and neglect had turned it into a solid matted pelt against her scalp. One evening, while the wind screamed around the eaves of the cabin, Caleb set a tin basin of steaming water on the heavy oak table. Beside it, he laid out a bar of lye soap, a bone-toothed comb, and his shears. He didn't ask. He just pulled out a chair. "Sit." Clara looked at the shears. The blade caught the orange light of the fire. She touched her head, her fingers catching in the impenetrable knots. She sat down, her back rigid, her hands gripping the edges of the wooden seat, so hard her knuckles bled white. Caleb stepped behind her. He didn't speak. He dipped a rag into the hot water and pressed it gently against the base of her neck, right where the raw purple ring from the iron collar was slowly fading into a pale scar. She let out a long, shuddering breath. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. "I'm going to have to cut most of it," Caleb said quietly. His voice was a low rumble in his chest. "It's too far gone." "Cut it," she whispered. "I don't want anything from that place left on me." Caleb took the shears. He worked slowly. He was a man accustomed to skinning elk and butchering hogs, his hands calloused and thick, but he moved with agonizing precision. He lifted the heavy matted clumps and snipped close to her scalp, careful not to nick the skin. The dead hair fell to the floorboard in heavy, dull thuds. When the worst of it was gone, he took the wet rag and the soap. He worked the lather into her scalp. His thumbs pressed against the tight muscles at the base of her skull, washing away the grease, the dirt, the lingering smell of the root cellar. Clara closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek, catching in the corner of her mouth. It tasted like salt and wood smoke. It was the first time in 3 years a man had touched her, without the intent to cause pain. The sheer, overwhelming relief of it broke something hard and calcified inside her chest. She leaned back, surrendering the weight of her head against Caleb's rough canvas shirt. Caleb froze. He felt the delicate press of her skull against his ribs. He breathed in the scent of lye soap and the clean, sharp smell of her skin underneath. He held entirely still, afraid that moving would shatter the fragile trust she had just handed him. He rinsed the soap away with a tin cup of clean water. He took a flour sack towel and dried her short, jagged hair. It curled wildly at the nape of her neck, a soft, honey-brown color that caught the firelight. "There." Caleb stepped back, clearing his throat. The sudden distance between them felt cold. "Better." Clara reached up, feeling the short, bristly ends of her hair. She turned in the chair to face him. Her blue eyes were clear, piercing in the dim light. The ghost was gone. A woman was sitting in his chair now. "Thank you, Caleb." He nodded, turning away to gather the fallen hair from the floor. "We leave in 2 days. The snow has crusted over enough to hold the mule's weight." "Will he recognize me?" Clara asked. Caleb paused, a fistful of ruined hair in his hand. He looked at her. With the short hair, the weight gain, and the heavy men's clothes she wore, she looked entirely different. But that wasn't what Caleb was counting on. Finch didn't see a person when he looked at you in that hole, Clara. Caleb said, his voice flat and hard. He saw a problem he buried. Men like that, they don't remember faces. They only remember their own cleverness. He thinks you're dead. We're going to use that. He walked over to his workbench. He opened a leather satchel and pulled out a small, blued steel Colt Lightning revolver. It was a double-action .38, smaller than his Peacemaker, but lethal. He walked back and placed it on the table in front of her. "Tomorrow I teach you how to pull the trigger," Caleb said. "Because if things go wrong down there, I'm not putting you back in a cage. You're going to shoot your way out." Clara looked at the gun. She didn't flinch this time. She reached out her pale fingers, wrapping around the checkered wooden grip. The steel was cold. It felt like a promise. "All right," she said. Oakhaven smelled of wet sawdust, coal smoke, and cheap whiskey. It was a boom town, a crude scar of civilization carved into the valley floor. Mud-clogged streets separated rows of false front buildings, saloons and supply houses. Logging wagons churned the slush into deep, freezing ruts. Caleb led Barnaby down the main thoroughfare. Clara rode in the saddle, wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat Caleb had tailored to fit her, a wide-brimmed felt hat pulled low over her eyes. The collar of the coat was turned up, hiding her neck. Nobody looked twice at a ragged trapper and his quiet companion. Winter brought all kinds of strays out of the mountains. They tied the mule in the alley behind a boarding house run by an old widow named Mrs. Gable. Caleb paid for the room with a silver dollar he'd kept buried in a coffee can for 3 years. The room was small, suffocatingly hot from a rattling iron radiator, and smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. Caleb dropped his pack on the narrow floorboards. He walked straight to the window, pulling the moth-eaten curtain back an inch. Finch's Mercantile was directly across the street. It was the largest building in town, a 2-story brick structure with a painted sign Tobias Finch, dry goods and mining supplies. "He's in there," Clara said. She was standing close behind Caleb. He could feel the tension radiating off her body like heat from a stove. She was staring at the brick building, her breathing shallow and fast. The trauma of the cellar was threatening to drag her back under. Caleb turned from the window. He put his large, calloused hands on her shoulders. He didn't grip her tightly. He just offered the solid, immovable weight of his presence. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Clara forced her eyes away from the Mercantile. She looked up at his face, the grey in his beard, the cold, calculating calm in his dark eyes. "You are not in the dirt," Caleb said, his thumbs brushing the rough wool of her coat. "You are not chained to a pine tree. You have a loaded .38 in your pocket, and you have me. He can't touch you unless he goes through me, and nobody goes through me." The panic in her chest subsided, replaced by a slow, burning warmth. She nodded once. "Good," Caleb said. He dropped his hands, moving to his pack. He pulled out a coil of thin wire, a lockpick set, and a heavy, leather-wrapped sap. "We can't just shoot him," Clara said, her voice steadying. "He owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. If you kill him, they'll hang you for murder, and they'll put me in an asylum." "I know." Caleb checked the cylinder of his Colt. "You said he kept a ledger. The real one. The one with the ghost names and the stolen rail money. He kept it in a floor safe in his office on the 2nd floor, under the Persian rug. The combination was 14328. Caleb holstered his gun. "If I bring that ledger to the territorial marshal in Missoula, Finch goes to a federal penitentiary. The locals can't protect him from the feds." "He locks the store at 8 o'clock, Clara said, stepping closer to him, her eyes sharp now with the tactical details of her former life. "He usually stays upstairs in his office, drinking brandy until midnight. He has a guard on the 1st floor, a man named Silas. Big, mean." "I've handled mean before," Caleb said. He picked up his hat. "Lock this door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me." 2 knocks, a pause, then 1. Clara caught his sleeve before he could turn away. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Caleb, He stopped, looking down at her hand on his arm. "Come back," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a plea, naked and desperate. She had survived 3 years of hell by closing herself off to everything. In 2 weeks, this gruff, silent mountain man had forced her back to life. She realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that she couldn't survive losing him. Caleb reached over and covered her hand with his. The calluses on his palm scraped against her skin. "I always come back," he said. The back door to Finch's Mercantile was heavy oak, reinforced with iron straps. It took Caleb 4 minutes in the freezing mud of the alley to pick the lock. It opened with a soft click, well-oiled and silent. He slipped inside. The first floor was a cavern of shadows smelling of coffee beans, oiled leather and kerosene. Moonlight bled through the high front windows, painting silver stripes across the wooden floorboards. Caleb moved silently, the soft leather of his moccasins making no sound. He navigated the aisles of stacked flower pickaxes and coiled rope. He heard the scrape of a chair from the front counter. Silas. Caleb crept to the end of the aisle. The guard was sitting by the stove, a double-barreled shotgun across his knees. He was a massive man wearing a bowler hat, pushed back on his thick head, currently occupied with picking his teeth with a matchstick. Caleb didn't draw his gun. A gunshot would bring the town down on him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy steel ball bearing. He tossed it lightly down the adjacent aisle. It hit a tin bucket with a sharp ping. Silas stopped picking his teeth. He stood up the chair legs, scraping loud in the quiet store. He brought the shotgun up, thumbing the hammers back. Click, clack. "Who's there?" Silas grunted, stepping away from the stove. He walked down the aisle toward the sound. As he passed Caleb's position, Caleb stepped out from the shadows like a ghost. He swung the leather-wrapped sap in a brutal, precise arc. It struck the base of Silas's skull with a sickening thud. Silas's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the floor like a dropped sack of grain. Caleb caught the shotgun before it clattered against the boards. He laid Silas out, breathing but unconscious, and moved to the back staircase. The wooden stairs creaked faintly under his weight, but the sound was masked by the wind howling outside. He reached the second-floor landing. A single line of yellow light bled from beneath a heavy door at the end of the hall. Caleb drew his Colt. He didn't bother with the lock. He kicked the door open. The wood splintered. The door smashed against the interior wall. Tobias Finch was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a handsome man, his silver hair neatly combed, wearing a tailored charcoal vest over a crisp white shirt. He held a crystal glass of amber liquid in his right hand. Finch didn't jump. He didn't scream. He simply looked up from his paperwork, a mild annoyance crossing his aristocratic features. "I assume Silas is taking a nap on the job again," Finch said, taking a slow sip of his brandy. He looked at Caleb's rugged clothes, the snow on his boots, the heavy revolver pointed at his chest. "You're a long way from the woods, Trapper. If you need credit, kicking my door down is a poor negotiation tactic." Caleb stepped into the room, kicking the broken door shut behind him with his heel. "I don't need credit, Finch," Caleb said. "Move away from the desk." Finch smiled. It was a cold, practiced smile. The smile of a man who believed he owned everything his eyes touched. "You don't know who I am, do you? You pull that trigger, you won't make it to the edge of town. My men will string you up from the telegraph pole. Move!" Caleb thumbed the hammer back. The mechanical click was loud in the plush room. Finch sighed, setting his glass down. He stood up, raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender, and stepped away from the desk. Caleb moved to the center of the room. He kicked the edge of the ornate Persian rug back. There, set into the floorboards, was the black steel dial of a safe. Finch's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, analyzing the ragged mountain man with sudden, sharp calculation. "How do you know about that?" Finch demanded, his voice losing its velvet edge. Caleb knelt, keeping his gun leveled at Finch's stomach. He reached down with his left hand spinning to the dial. 14. 32. 8. The heavy locking bolts clanked loudly. Caleb pulled the iron handle up. The safe swung open. Inside were stacks of banded cash and a heavy black leather ledger. Caleb grabbed the ledger. Finch was staring at Caleb, his mind racing. Only one person had ever known that combination. Only one person had seen the real books. "Who sent you?" Finch whispered, his face turning pale. "She's dead. I saw the collar. I saw the bone. She was chained to a pine tree, Finch," Caleb said, standing up, shoving the ledger into his coat pocket. "She was eating rotten potatoes in the dark." Finch swallowed hard. The realization hit him. He had stopped going up the mountain 3 months ago, when the first heavy snows hit. He assumed the cold had finally finished the job. "She told you?" Finch scoffed, recovering his composure. He let out a harsh laugh. "That crazy bitch. Nobody is going to believe her. And nobody is going to believe a feral mountain man who smells like bear grease." "The territorial marshal will believe the handwriting in this book," Caleb said. Finch's hand suddenly darted toward a half-open drawer on the side of his desk. Caleb didn't hesitate. He didn't shout a warning. He squeezed the trigger. The Colt roared. The flash illuminated the dark wood of the office. The .45 caliber slug caught Finch in the right shoulder, spinning him violently. He crashed backward into a bookshelf, shattering glass, screaming in agony. A small silver derringer clattered from his hand to the floor. Caleb walked over and kicked the derringer under the desk. Finch was clutching his shoulder blood, rapidly soaking his crisp white shirt, staining his charcoal vest black. He stared up at Caleb with wide, terrified eyes. The velvet glove was gone. The monster underneath was just a bleeding, pathetic man. "You're dead," Finch hissed through gritted teeth, blood bubbling on his lips. "I'll spend every dime I have hunting you both down." "You won't have a dime," Caleb said. "And you won't be hunting anyone from a federal cell." Caleb backed toward the door, his gun still trained on the bleeding mare. He had the proof. He had the ledger. It was time to get Clara and ride out before Silas woke up, or the gunshot drew the town watch. He slipped out the door, moving quickly down the hall, but as he reached the landing of the stairs, the front door of the mercantile below smashed open. Lantern light flooded the first floor. "Finch!" A voice roared from the dark. "We heard a shot." Caleb froze. 3 men armed with repeating rifles were standing over Silas's unconscious body. They were Finch's hired enforcers from the logging camps, hard men who killed for $1 a day. Caleb gripped the banister, the heavy ledger pulling at his coat. He was trapped on the 2nd floor. And back in the boarding house across the street, Clara was waiting for a knock that might never come. Caleb hit the floorboards a fraction of a second before the stairwell disintegrated. 3 Winchester rifles roared in unison. Lead tore through the oak banister, turning it into lethal flying splinters. Plaster rained from the ceiling. Caleb scrambled backward on his elbows, dragging himself out of the fatal funnel of the landing, the heavy ledger digging painfully into his ribs. He pressed his back against the wall of the corridor. The air was thick with grey smoke and the acrid stench of cordite. He did the math in his head. The enemy 3, hard men with repeating rifles fully loaded. The terrain. A narrow, straight staircase offering 0 cover. The exit. The front doors were blocked. The rear door was blocked. The alternative, a 2nd-story window drop 20 feet down into frozen mud and discarded iron machinery. It was a dead man's hand. "Finch," one of the men below shouted. "You alive up there?" "Kill him!" Finch's voice shrieked from the office, ragged and breathless with pain. "He's in the hall. $10,000 to whoever puts a bullet in his skull." Caleb heard the distinct, heavy thud of boots taking the first step. They were coming up. They would spread out on the landing and pepper the hallway until nothing was left breathing. Caleb rolled onto his stomach. He didn't blind fire. Ammunition was life. He waited until a shadow crossed the rising lantern light on the wall. He extended the heavy Colt, leveled the sights at chest height over the top stair, and squeezed the trigger. The roar in the confined space was deafening. A heavy thud followed, accompanied by a wet, choking gasp. One down. "Jesus, Coles, hit!" a voice yelled. The boots retreated down the stairs. Suppressing fire erupted again, chewing through the floorboards inches from Caleb's face. Across the street, inside the sweltering room of Mrs. Gable's boarding house, Clara stood frozen by the window. The first gunshot had stopped her heart. The subsequent volley sounded like a war. She pressed her face against the cold glass. The Mercantile across the street was lit up with the stroboscopic flashes of muzzle fire. 2 knocks, a pause, then 1. He had told her to lock the door. He had told her to wait. She looked down at the .38 Colt Lightning resting on the quilt of the bed. It was small. The blued steel caught the meager light of the street lamp outside. She thought of the root cellar. She thought of the dark, the cold, the smell of her own slow death. Caleb had walked into that darkness and pulled her out. Clara picked up the gun. The wood grip was rough against her palm. She didn't put on her coat. She unlocked the boarding house door and slipped into the hallway, moving with the silent, desperate speed of a cornered animal. Back in the Mercantile, Caleb was running out of time. He heard the scrape of a wooden crate below. They were barricading the bottom of the stairs. They were going to trap him up here and wait him out, or worse, burn the building down with him in it. Men who worked for Finch didn't care about property. They cared about the bounty. Caleb crawled back to Finch's office. The door was hanging by a single hinge. Finch was sitting on the floor, his back against the mahogany desk, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked up, his face, a mask of pale, sweating terror. "You're a dead man." Finch spat through the venom lacked conviction. Caleb ignored him. He grabbed a brass kerosene lamp from a side table. He unscrewed the cap, dousing the expensive Persian rug and the wooden floorboards near the door. He struck a match against the heel of his boot and tossed it. The kerosene caught with a loud whoosh. A sheet of blue and orange flame instantly walled off the office from the hallway. The heat was immediate and blistering. "What are you doing?" Finch screamed, scrambling backward away from the fire. "Making an exit," Caleb grunted. He moved to the heavy plate glass window overlooking the street. He didn't bother trying to unlatch it. He wrapped his heavy canvas coat around his forearm and smashed the glass. The winter wind howled into the room, feeding the flames behind him. He looked down. A sloped wooden awning stretched over the Mercantile's boardwalk. It was covered in a thick layer of snow and ice. Caleb holstered his gun. He swung a leg over the sill. Down on the street, the front doors of the Mercantile burst open. The 2 remaining enforcers spilled out onto the boardwalk, coughing from the smoke that was now rolling through the first floor. They looked up. "There!" one of them yelled, raising his Winchester. Before the man could cock the lever, a sharp, flat crack echoed through the street. It wasn't Caleb's heavy .45. It was a lighter caliber. The enforcer with the rifle cried out, dropping his weapon and grabbing his thigh. He collapsed into the slush. The second man spun around, trying to find the shooter in the dark street. Clara stepped out from the narrow alleyway beside the boarding house. She held the .38 with both hands, her arms straight, her stance wide, just like Caleb had shown her on the ridge. She wasn't shaking. Her blue eyes were dead cold. She cocked the hammer and fired again. The bullet shattered the wooden post an inch from the second man's head. he yelled, diving behind a water trough for cover. Caleb didn't waste the distraction. He dropped from the window, hitting the icy awning hard. He slid down the slope and launched himself off the edge, landing heavily in the deep snow of the street. His knees buckled, but he forced himself up instantly, drawing his Colt. He leveled it at the man hiding behind the trough. "Don't move. Don't even breathe." The man looked at Caleb's gun, then across the street to Clara, who was walking slowly forward, her weapon still raised. The enforcer raised his empty hands. Caleb looked at Clara. The flannel shirt whipped in the bitter wind. She looked terrifying. She looked magnificent. "I told you to wait," Caleb said, his chest heaving. "You were taking too long," Clara replied. The gunfire had woken the town. Oil lamps flared in windows up and down the main street. Doors creaked open. Men stepped out onto the boardwalks, holding shotguns and lanterns, peering through the falling snow at the standoff in front of the Mercantile. Smoke billowed from the shattered second-story window. "Sheriff!" someone yelled. Someone, a heavy-set man wearing a tin star, hurried down the boardwalk, pushing through the gathering crowd. He stopped 10 yards from Caleb, his hand resting cautiously on the butt of his revolver. He looked at the bleeding enforcers, the smoke, and finally at Caleb. "Drop the iron, stranger." The sheriff ordered his voice, attempting an authority he clearly didn't feel. "You're under arrest for armed robbery and attempted murder. He didn't rob anything." Clara's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. She stepped into the pool of light cast by the sheriff's lantern. Several townspeople gasped. They knew her, or they knew the ghost of her. "Clara," an older woman in a shawl whispered from the crowd. "Lord Almighty Finch said you ran off to San Francisco with a mining engineer." "Finch lied," Clara said. She didn't yell, but the absolute stillness in her voice made the words carry. She lowered her gun but didn't holster it. "He chained me in a root cellar on the North Ridge for 3 years. He left me to rot in my own filth, so I couldn't tell you the truth." The crowd shifted, a restless, confused energy rippling through them. The sheriff frowned. "That's a wild accusation, Clara. Mayor Finch is an upstanding—" "Mayor Finch is a thief," Caleb interrupted. He reached into his coat and pulled out the heavy black ledger. He tossed it into the slush at the sheriff's feet. "Pick it up," Caleb ordered. The sheriff hesitated, looking up at the burning second floor, then down at the book. He stooped and picked it up. "Turn to the back pages," Caleb said. "Look at the Rail Spur Fund. Look at the land deeds transferred to the Oakhaven Development Company. Then look at who owns that company." The sheriff opened the ledger. He squinted in the lantern light. His lips moved silently as he read the columns of numbers, the dates, the names. A slow, sickening realization washed the color from his face. Upstairs, the fire was spreading. The glass of a neighboring window blew out with a sharp crash. Tobias Finch appeared in the frame, his face blackened with soot, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Sheriff!" Finch screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Arrest them! They stole my property. They tried to kill me." The sheriff looked up at the mayor. He looked at the ledger in his hands. He looked at Clara, seeing the brutal, jagged haircut, the hollows of her cheeks, the faint, undeniable purple bruising that ringed her throat like a phantom collar. The townspeople were looking at it too. The silence in the street turned heavy and dangerous. It wasn't the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of a mob realizing they had been played for fools. "Sheriff," Finch called out again, his voice faltering as he saw the faces looking up at him. The sheriff slowly closed the ledger. He didn't look at Finch. He looked at Caleb. "You riding out?" the sheriff asked quietly. "We're riding to Missoula," Caleb said. "Handing this over to the territorial marshal. Federal crime. Federal penitentiary." The sheriff nodded slowly. He stepped aside. "Road's clear." "Sheriff!" Finch shrieked. Get a bucket brigade going." The sheriff suddenly barked to the crowd, completely ignoring the man in the window. "We don't want the fire spreading to the livery." Nobody moved toward the mercantile. They just watched it burn. Caleb walked over to Clara. He took her arm gently. "Let's get Barnaby. We have a long ride." They walked back down the alley, the chaotic shouting of the town fading behind them. Caleb saddled the mule in silence. Clara stood beside him, the adrenaline leaving her system, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. She leaned heavily against the wooden siding of the boarding house. Caleb finished tightening the cinch. He turned to her. He reached out and gently brushed a flake of ash from her cheek. "You didn't need to come out there," he said softly. "Yes, I did," Clara said. She looked up at him, her eyes catching the orange glow reflecting off the low clouds. "I'm done waiting in the dark for someone to decide if I live or die." Caleb stared at her. He saw the iron in her spine. It was stronger than the chain that had bound her. He hoisted her into the saddle, wrapping the buffalo coat tightly around her legs. He took the lead rope, turning his back on the burning town, and led them toward the dark, quiet sanctuary of the mountains. The federal marshals rode into Oak Haven 3 days later. They didn't find a powerful mayor. They found a broken man with a festering bullet wound, living in the charred ruins of a mercantile universally despised by a town that had once treated him like a king. The ledger was all the proof the judge in Missoula needed. Tobias Finch was sentenced to 20 years hard labor at the territorial prison. He lasted 4 months before a sudden fever took him in the damp stone cells. Caleb and Clara never went back to Oak Haven to hear the verdict. They didn't need to. Spring came late to the Bitterroots. The heavy snows melted slowly, turning the ravines into rushing torrents of ice water. The dead grey pines burst with vivid green needles. The air smelled of wet earth and returning life. Caleb stood on the porch of his cabin, a steaming tin cup of black coffee in his hand. He watched a doe and her fawn pick their way carefully through the tall grass at the edge of the clearing. The door behind him creaked open. Clara stepped out. She wasn't wearing a man's flannel shirt anymore. She wore a simple canvas dress she had stitched together from supplies they had bought in Missoula. Her hair had grown out into soft, thick curls that framed her face. The hollows in her cheeks were gone, replaced by the healthy, sun-browned flush of the high country. The scar on her neck was still there. It would always be there. A thin, pale ring of memory. But she didn't hide it anymore. She stood beside him, leaning against the rough-hewn timber rail. She held her own cup of coffee, breathing in the sharp, clean pine air. "I was thinking," Clara said, her voice smooth and clear now. "That's dangerous," Caleb murmured, taking a sip from his cup, though the corner of his mouth twitched upward behind his greying beard. "I was thinking about the South Ridge," she continued, ignoring his gruffness. "The soil there is softer, less rock. If we clear some of the deadfall, we could plant a proper garden this summer. Potatoes, carrots, maybe even some squash." Caleb looked at her. A garden meant putting down roots. It meant preparing for the next winter and the winter after that. It meant permanence. For a man who had spent his life walking away from the world, it was a terrifying thought. But looking at her bathed in the morning light, Caleb realized he wasn't afraid. The absolute silence of the mountains which he had once loved because it asked nothing of him, suddenly felt hollow, without her voice in it. He set his tin cup down on the rail. "We'll need to fence it," Caleb said, looking out toward the South Ridge. "Deer will eat the shoots before they ever breach the soil. Needs a high fence. Sturdy." Clara smiled. It was a small, quiet thing, but it reached all the way to her blue eyes. Then we better get to work, she said. Caleb nodded. He reached out his thick, calloused fingers, finding her hand resting on the rail. He didn't grip it tightly. He just held it, offering the solid, immovable weight of his presence. Clara didn't pull away. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. They stood there as the sun crested the high peaks, chasing the last shadows of the long winter out of the valley below. The iron was broken. The earth was soft. It was time to grow. Thank you for watching this story of survival grit and frontier justice. If Caleb and Clara's journey